The Trail of the Red Sparrow. Paul brushed aside the fresh snow covering the stone. My father lay underneath on the cold ground. Adonai tsuriva goali, it said, God is my strength and my redeemer. An unquestioning faith. But he wasn't an unquestioning man, deeply analytical, in fact, intensely curious to the day he died. The wind blew in uninterrupted across Lake Erie. It was bone-chilling cold. We cleared more snow from around the stone. Hadn't been there for a quarter of a century. But the stone, the simple pronouncement of faith, began to bring it all back. I had come across a little red prayer book from the Amor Avenue shul, about the size of a big little book. And inside the cover, my mother had apparently written something about how the shul had given it to me on my bar mitzvah over 60 years ago. Opposite her writing was a little name stamp, Or Chadosh Anshe Sfard, roughly translated, a sacred light to the people of Spain. The formal name of the Amor Avenue shul. There it was, the mystical connection to the Sfardim. I could never trace the genealogical link. My father's family and their landsmen who founded and sustained the Amor Avenue shul were first-generation immigrants from Russia, not Spain. They were Ashkenazim, not Sephardim. They had come from the disputed territories of Russian Poland, from areas in the Ukraine and Belarus, and from regions near the Romanian and Austrian borders. Our family name was in fact German in origin, not Spanish. Yet there was always that mystical link. And there was even some specificity. The link was to the island of Majorca, as if there were something elevating about that. There was always a certain pride in professing the link, as if there was something purer about the Sephardim. Maybe it was the white sand that my father found spread on the floors in the Sephardic synagogues in Latin America when he spoke there seeking havens for German refugees during the Holocaust. Maybe it was simply because Sephardim arrived here first, and somehow that made them more authentic. He was a proud man. Maybe he imagined that a certain superiority and cultural civility surrounded the tails and top hats they wore to services in the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in New York. I don't know. But the mysterious tie had reappeared when I discovered that little prayer book with the Or Chadosh stamp on the cover page. And I had never uncovered the link to my pure Sephardic roots. Finding my mother and father in the Mayfield Cemetery had been easy despite the new snow. The superintendent had graciously left careful directions tacked to his office door, and Paul, our resourceful Red Sparrow driver, had located the graves rather quickly. My grandparents' graves would be another matter. They were in a suburban cemetery further out, where the gates had been left open for visitation that cold Sunday in February, but where the keeper was nowhere to be found. The Red Sparrow entered the gates of the suburban cemetery, and Paul followed the directional signs toward the areas designated for synagogues and other groups. But the snow was 2 feet high, and there were countless congregations and endless burials. He drove slowly down a lightly plowed road that seemed somewhat central, but the graves were infinite and set so many rows deep that most were not visible from the limo. There were over 200,000 graves in the cemetery, and clearly the search was futile. No direction, no clue. Implausibly, Paul spotted a headstone. It was about 50 feet in from the road. Our family name was carved in bold letters, just big enough to be spotted by the hawk-eyed driver from that distance. I had missed it. He stopped, and I bolted from the red Cadillac and ran to it awkwardly, plowing through the snow above my knees. Was it theirs? The footstones were not visible. They were buried under 2 feet of snow. They should be under there. Paul had a tool. He dug rapidly and reached the footstones, but the writing was indiscernible, blurred by a thick cover of ice. Paul slogged back to the trunk of the car, returned with an ice chopper, and began to chip away the ice from the footstone. At first, nothing. But then my grandfather's name appeared. And in a nanosecond, they sprang to life, all of them. On an autumn afternoon, congregating around the gleaming white steps of the Amor Avenue shul beneath a large, round, luminous stained glass window. An orange light seemed to radiate from inside the building. Yom Kippur, 1943. The leaves had begun to fall and a chill wind had already begun to blow in across the lake. The day-long service was endless. Inside it was stuffy, and fasting didn't help to curb their attention deficit as the day wore on. The big oaken doors would open and shut as the men drifted in and out in fits and starts, but my grandfather was not among them. It was beneath his dignity. He was a proud man, aristocratic in appearance and bearing, an intellectual with little formal schooling. Although he was an agnostic, until just last month he had served as their president, and he wouldn't deign to leave the service. He never did, so he wasn't outside with the slackers. But as his name appeared, his aura had begun to envelop me, more so as the ice broke away. Like on the day he died. I remembered it then. I was not a varsity athlete, but I recall lying on a training table at the Harvard Athletic Association. It was a training facility at Soldiers Field. I had a severely sprained right ankle. It was being taped by a trainer, and suddenly my grandfather appeared, calling my name. At that very moment, I learned he was dying 600 miles away. It all began to come back, my relationship with the old man. When I'd returned from my first semester as a freshman at Harvard, I was all full of myself, erudite. I had delved profoundly into the depths of Greek philosophy as freshmen do, and I had emerged a sophisticate. So I prattled on to the old man like a peacock preening its feathers. When I had begun to describe the essence of Aristotle, I mentioned the Nicomachean Ethic. It was then that he began to quote from it, or from a similar Aristotelian text, and I was struck dumb. My grandfather had read Aristotle in Yiddish, and more importantly, he had absorbed it. After all, he said, the Rambam, Maimonides, was an avid student of Aristotle and had brilliantly integrated Aristotelian rationalism into Judaic textual material in the 12th century, helping to preserve it for both Jewish and Western civilization. He referred me to Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, a text I have failed to comprehend to this day. He was a rag peddler. He had a little rag shop where I remember seeing him sitting and sorting rags, wipers or something they were called. I think they were used by machine shops or factories. I'm not really sure. I do not even know to what end he sat sorting them. He was making a living of sorts from it, I guess, but how incongruous it was. A scholar like that sorting rags. But on Pesach he was a prince. He sat at the head of the table surrounded by the entire family. On both sides they came to him, and he davened, and he sang, and he discussed. And then he picked apart the Haggadah, finding new meanings each year. And then he sang again, and as he did so, he pounded the table with delight. And all those around him seemed to worship him as the patriarch he was. He loved Judaism for its richness, its feeling, its humanity, its warmth. And he threw himself into its traditions with an unequivocal love. And his understanding and appreciation for the Torah was monumental, this agnostic rag peddler at the head of the Seder table, this agnostic former president of the Amor Avenue shul, this matchless prince. As the ice on my grandmother's footstone began to disappear, I was climbing the stairs on the left side of the lobby to the balcony of the shul, where the women sat weeping, inhaling smelling salts to keep from fainting. I remember the lavender smell of the salts, how sickeningly sweet it was. And I remembered the women listening to the chazan, chanting in a language they were forbidden to learn, Hebrew, the sacred language. But they didn't need a translator. They knew intuitively just what he was chanting. And they wept bitter tears, begging God for forgiveness for sins they had never committed in a language they were forbidden to know. Because they knew what was happening. It was Auschwitz. It was Dachau. And though it wasn't official, they knew instinctively what was happening. And so they prayed to God to forgive them in the only way they knew how, in the remote, forlorn hope that a compassionate God would hear them and be merciful to those they had left behind. A blind faith in a pure, benevolent God. Adonai Tsuri V'Goali. And as the ice continued to dissolve, I remember her hurrying home before Nila, so there would be a table prepared for the men to break the fast when they returned. She was a superior cook. Her kreplach were by acclamation the best in the neighborhood. In fact, they often began to disappear while the pot was still on the stove. I know, I was one of the culprits. And her chicken matzo ball soup was worth waiting for, even through the seemingly endless first half of the Seder, before the afikoman and the singing and the fun part. She was not even 5 foot tall, but she was a giant. When my grandfather had left Bialotserka in the Ukraine in 1904 to escape further service under the Tsar, as certain war loomed in Vladivostok, she remained with 3 little boys. He sent for them in 1907, and she journeyed with my father, age 8, and his 2 brothers, age 6 and 5. They bribed the border guards, crossed over into Poland, then Germany, and set sail from Hamburg, and then from Glasgow and steerage on the SS Caledonia. It was a very small ship. They challenged the North Atlantic in the early fall. She arrived in Ellis Island with a total of $10, according to the ship's manifest, and a destination tag that read Cleveland, Ohio. The North Atlantic had been very rough. The audio tape at Ellis Island tells how numerous steerage passengers like them had found the passage so unbearable that they had hurled themselves into the raging sea. The horrible smells, the unsanitary conditions, the stifling humidity, and the mass of humanity crammed like cattle into the hold, the inedible gruel, the continuous seasickness, and the seemingly endless voyage drove many others to near suicide. Upon arrival, after the first and second class passengers were welcomed ashore with military bands in Manhattan, she, along with the other steerage passengers, were returned to Ellis Island. There were no bands playing there. As they disembarked, they were herded into pens to be deloused, physically examined, interrogated, and named, all the time knowing that if any one of them failed any test, the entire family group would be returned to certain death in Russia. Only when they survived the grueling medical and psychological tests were they begrudgingly granted an unheralded entrance into the Golden Medina. They were proud people. It was an abject humiliation none would ever forget. She was a survivor. She was a giant. I remembered that as the ice on her grave continued to dissolve. My Uncle Benny was not outside on the steps, but for a different reason than my grandfather. He had just been elected president of the shul, and he was expected to stick it out inside the whole day. Uncle Benny always sat in the front right, draped in a tallis that was enormous. It was by far the biggest one in the shul. It went from his head all the way down to the floor, and the tzitzis would have dragged in the dirt had he not continuously lifted the garment and thrown its folds back over his shoulders. Benny sat there dutifully throughout the interminable service. He was truly inspirational to me. He knew all the prayers in that whole long prayer book by heart and in Hebrew. What a resplendent person he was, with his beaming red face, his long white beard, wrapped in that magnificent long tallis there in the front row where all could see. He looked indistinguishable from one of those familiar portraits of Eastern European Hasidic rabbis at prayer. Or so I thought, as I watched Uncle Benny bobbing in and out of that tallis. The pageant went something like this. The chazan would chant just the first sentence or two of a prayer, and then the whole congregation would dive into themselves. After the first verse, Uncle Benny would disappear into his tallis and would not emerge for air until the chazan would sing the last verse of the prayer. Then Uncle Benny would surface, something like a whale coming up for a breather, and then he would dive down again after the first verse of the next prayer. This aquatic dance would continue throughout the day, and Uncle Benny never went outside. It wasn't until I was much older that I realized what was really going on. Uncle Benny popped in and out like that because he really didn't know much of the rest of the prayers beyond their first lines. And he didn't want anybody to know that the president really didn't know. Apparently, Benny had not been the sharpest tool in the cheder, but Benny was a successful rag peddler. He gave heavily to that little shul. He loved it and its people. And wasn't there a certain nobility in that? The ice continued to melt. Cousin Jake the florist sat in the back. He really wasn't a florist. He just worked in a flower shop. Jake had emigrated from Russia as an orphan, and he lived pretty much by himself. He lived in constant fear of being conspicuous, for he wasn't a citizen. He could not become one until he could prove legal entry into the United States. And no one could remember how he came, which port of entry, what year, which ship. So he carried that stigma with him as a scarlet letter, and he internalized it, and he had become shy, retiring, self-effacing. If the shul were filled, he would give up his seat, as if he felt he was undeserving. He didn't have the means available to the likes of the powerful Greek shipping magnates, who hired lawyers to scan ancient ships' manifests to find their names, looking for some phonetic mutation, some curious cacophony that was them and that would prove their legitimate entry. I was to do this for him myself a decade later during the McCarran and McCarthy shame, when as an alien he faced the dread of possible unemployment and deportation. But for all his reticence, Jake always showed up at my grandmother's table at holiday time, and he always brought flowers. It was as if he made his mark that way, like he was signing his name. There was an innocence about him that was magical. It was radiant in a way. I liked Jake. As the large oak door swung open and shut, portions of the Chazan's chant were intermittently audible. The voice was that of Chazan Pedetsky, the cantor. He was great, inspirational at times, iridescent seeming in his clean white robes and his tall white hat. He had a beautiful, resonant voice. He was aware that people came in and out, but he was also aware that there were times when no one dared go in and out, like when he chanted the Kol Nidre. Pedetsky's Kol Nidre was memorable, majestic, pleading forgiveness for broken vows. During the Kol Nidre, the doors were shut. There was an all-male choir of 3 that stood with him on the bima, with the ever-present tuning fork. There wasn't a dry eye in the shul when Pedetsky chanted the Kol Nidre. I'm sure it was rewarding to him. He was a king, an honored guest in my grandmother's house. It was an honor to have the great Pedetsky break the fast in your home. That was the awe in which he was held by that little community. Of course, Pedetsky lived in a shadow, the shadow of the great touring cantors. It was an age of the great cantors, legends, names like Kusevitsky, Pinchik, and Richard Tucker. They toured the country, and when they came to Cleveland, invariably they davened at the Amor Avenue shul. When this happened, poor Pedetsky shuddered. There would be inevitable comparisons. But soon after, they left, and he was king again. The people still adored Pedetsky. He was still an honored guest in their homes, and the people still came in and out, but never when Pedetsky in his clean white robes chanted the Kol Nidre. As the ice receded, I knew I had to go back. Where in hell is Amor Avenue? I've worked for Red Sparrow for 15 years. I've never heard of Amor Avenue. Look, you'll find it. I'm sure you'll find it. It's got to be on your map. I've just been there. I've been there 60 years ago. I was there, and they don't move streets. I know it's there. Just look. Please look. It's somewhere off 105th Street. Paul buried his head in the map. Suddenly, his jaw dropped. You can't be serious. You're kidding. Look, you really don't want to go there, mister. It's not for people like us not there. For sure, not in a Red Sparrow. You don't understand, Paul. I'm already there. You've got to take me back. Paul shuddered and locked the doors. The Red Sparrow turned west. This would cost, but there was no price on this. We left white suburbia and started down the long abandoned trolley tracks of the inner city. As we sped north along 105th Street, the massive gold dome of the Alhambra-like Ansel Road Temple loomed large, like the ghost of a bygone era. The building was a monument to the early German Reform movement with its services on Sunday instead of Saturday, its organist, its professional non-Jewish choir. But ironically, under the rabbinic leadership of Abba Hillel Silver in the 1930s and 1940s, it had emerged as the fountainhead of the world Zionist movement, a development its founders would have abhorred. Silver, a giant both physically and intellectually, had filled the cavernous 2,500-seat sanctuary every Sunday during the fight for Israel's birth, as he and Rabbi Stephen Wise of New York led that cause at the United Nations in 1947 and 1948. As a student in this religious school for 12 years, I had witnessed greatness in the pulpit there. But just a mile and a half down the trolley tracks lay the Amor Avenue shul. For a mere 3-cent trolley ride, I could shuttle every Sunday from the exalted religious perch of the likes of the Lehmans, Loebs, and Rothschilds of Cleveland to the shtetl off 105th Street on Amor Avenue. The Sparrow was now traveling down the tracks of my bifurcated Jewish world. And then the boards appeared. Boards everywhere. Store windows, house windows, churches. I didn't see them. See that cop there? He was looking at me funny, like what the hell's a red Cadillac with Whitey doing on 105th Street? Only 2 reasons, pimping or pushing. Ain't too many white pimps down here, so he must have thought pushing. Good thing you're sitting up front there. Guess you don't look much like a dealer. But now that you had your little adventure, mister, let's get the hell out of here before he changes his mind. I ignored him. Paul, turn right at Bundle's candy store on the corner of Amor Avenue. Bundle's always sat in a corner at the back of the shul, near Jake, because Bundle's was outside on the steps a lot, and from the back corner, not many could see him dart out. He was the eternal kid, Bundle's. The penny candy store was where you were faced with the first earth-shattering choices of your young life. You went in with a shiny new nickel, Hanukkah gelt, and the whole world opened up to you. Jawbreakers, those marvelous, mountainous, cinnamon-coated gumballs that stuck out in your jaw, made it look as if you had a toothache, and you would keep taking them out of your mouth all the time to see them change color until you got down to the chewing gum. And then there was the button candy, all those dots of candy on a long piece of white paper. I could never figure those out. Never got those much. Tootsie Rolls, the little ones, and Mary Janes with peanut butter that stuck to your teeth, and Sugar Daddies and licorice sticks, the red and the black ones, and the mint caramels, and the peppermint stink candy. It was all there in a great fantasy land, all open to you for a penny apiece. With a nickel, you were a king. With a dime, you could be an emperor. I remember Bundles patiently holding that little white paper bag, pleading with me to make my earth-shattering decisions. I could never understand his impatience. These were, after all, momentous and about to become irrevocable decisions. Once Bundles popped the candy into the bag, he wouldn't take it out. It was yours. There was no going back. No candy store in the corner, just more boards in the windows. Turn right anyway, Paul. I know what's here. Don't you see the sign, Amor? The Red Sparrow turned right, and there it was, right there, almost on the corner, just 2 lots down. There was a name, a prominent sign, Elim Evangelical Church of Christ. The big round stained glass window was now boards. Paul drove past. Okay, now can we get the hell out of here? Paul, I have to get out. Keep going around the block. If you have to, but come back. We drove around the block. Over half the block was boarded up, but it was Sunday and people were walking with prayer books and Bibles. It really didn't seem all that threatening. When we returned, the Elim Evangelical Church was in session. Pull in the driveway, Paul, and undo the safety catch on the door locks. I'm getting out. Don't get out. I have to. I got out and began to climb the white steps. They hadn't been painted for decades, and there were holes between the step joints. But at the top of the stairs, the old oak doors were still there. The great stained glass window was now a round board. And then there was singing, joyous singing, enthusiastic singing, harmonic singing, a clipped rhythmical choir in perfect unison, joyously praising their Lord, elegant, innocent, unsullied. I ventured through the oak doors into the lobby. There was another set of doors to the sanctuary. To the left were the stairs to the balcony, where I would climb to see my grandmother. They, too, were unpainted. The plaster was peeling off the walls now, in numerous ragged spots all the way upstairs. The singing intensified. I wonder if the bema was still there, where Padetsky davened Kol Nidre and Kusevitsky and Richard Tucker sang, and where I chanted my bar mitzvah portion. I wondered whether the bench up front was still there, the bench where Uncle Benny bobbed and weaved, and that corner in the back where Jake and Bundles tried to disappear. Is that still there? Do they have any idea what went before them here? What prayer wafted to the heavens from the balcony of this sacred place during the depths of the Holocaust? What pleas were lifted on high from this place to a God they prayed was a benevolent God, a God of compassion and mercy? Did they understand the majesty of this place and what purity was bound up in that mystical tie of the Anshe Svart? Did they know that? Those who now sang praises to a God they dared to believe was a benevolent God of compassion and mercy? Those who lived behind boards? Should I tell them what went before them in this place? Would they care? Was there any remnant of that left here? Dare I open that door and tell them? I felt suddenly out of place here now. There was a certain deep-rooted and sincere spirituality here, a blind faith. But Benny and Jake, Bundles, Padetsky, and my proud grandfather and grandmother, all of them had vanished now from this place. This was not their place. Their building had shrunk and had become a rotting shell of peeling plaster and paint. There was nothing of them left but my imagination. They had all vanished into the vapor. I didn't belong inside this place. I backed away, opened the oak door, and started down the faded white steps. The door banged shut, and the singing receded. Paul was leaning out of the window of the Red Sparrow. He was pointing to something embedded in the front wall, a faded, almost indiscernible white square that had been painted over many times in an attempt to cover it up. But there was something still barely discernible chiseled into the stone that would not give up. Or Kadosh, Anshe Svart.